So we're going to move to William Wordsworth and his preface to Lyrical Ballads. Wordsworth is the poet associated with the Romantic movement in England. And this work, Lyrical Ballads, is something that he co-authored with Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The two of them contributed poems to it. Wordsworth contributed the lion's share, and he was regarded by Coleridge as a genius. And Coleridge, for reasons that he probably regretted afterwards, thought that Wordsworth would provide a better preface than he himself would, Coleridge. But Coleridge, we now know, and Wordsworth himself would have probably acknowledged, was the far superior critic and inclined to be a critic, whereas Wordsworth really was not. In fact, he said he never gave a jot about theory, direct quote, and felt sort of pushed by Coleridge to do this, and then was really aggrieved when Coleridge took issue with what he wrote. Said, "You told me to do this, and now you're criticizing it." And he said, "Yes, but I told you not to use the word imagination because you don't understand it rightly, and you're misrepresenting both of us," and so forth. Anyway, I won't get into the whole fallout between the two of them. I will get to that when I come to Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, which he writes 19 years after this, in 1817. So this is 1798 is when this is first written, the Lyrical Ballads, and this is the second edition that we have here. The second edition of the Lyrical Ballads. It's expanded somewhat, but it is intended to explain the poems that we'll read over the next few classes. And the poems are regarded as the preface is regarded as a manifesto for the Romantic movement. Whatever you make of it, whether you like the defense or not, Coleridge didn't, it is still regarded by the literary establishment as the beginning of the Romantic movement, and really, in some ways, its best articulation. You can take issue with that. As I say, he never carried a straw about theory, and despite that, spent a great deal of time trying to come up with why he wrote what he wrote, and he revised it multiple times. But the 1800 version is the second edition, and it's regarded as fairly definitive. Like many writers, when they later revise things, the later edition is worse than the original. They've amended the later editions for various reasons, and they often lose something of the original force as they carry on. So editing has some benefits, but you lose something in the process as well. You've probably realized this yourself. If you write something first time, it can have certain flaws, but it also has certain benefits. But you can get rid of the flaws, but you often lose the force of the original as well. So anyway, and I think that's the case with Wordsworth. I don't think he ages well as a poet. That'll also go for his great work, The Prelude. It's better in the 1805 version than in the 1850 version. But the preface is here to, and I'll say more about this when we look at this in literary theory, because we'll look at this in our lit theory class as well. It's intended to refute neoclassical literary theory. Neoclassical literary theory being that of the 18th century. And this morning I looked at classicism as represented by Horace, and neoclassical literary theory is a revision of that, but more in line with the French Academy, the Académie Française. That really begins with Aristotle and with his definition of the tragedy, the three unities of the tragedy, and so forth. But it's an attempt to recapture a classical viewpoint in a modern context. Just like the Renaissance, is a rebirth of classical learning. The neoclassical movement is an attempt to recapture the classicism of Horace and so forth in a scientific age. And Wordsworth takes issue with that. So this is a reaction against neoclassical poetics. So you're reading a response to something that you may not even have read. So with that, it's like hearing one side of a conversation. I'll try and fill in a little bit what he's pushing against. But he is providing the basic 19th century view of poetry, and argues that it is essentially speech. Essentially speech, as opposed to artifice. Which is a very odd view of poetry. The historic view of poetry, the poema, is that it is the product of art, techne. Horace writes the ars poetica. We looked at that this morning. But the art is, there's a way, there's a technique to doing it. Wordsworth's push is against the art and in favor of inspiration, spontaneity, originality. He favors nature over art, and that it's actually not a bad way to do that, to see it as a very simplistic sort of dichotomy between things like art and nature, and mimesis versus expression. And it is anti-mimetic. So I talked this morning about the neoclassical, or about even the classical tradition, as essentially mimetic. It views art as representing reality. It's as were to hold a mirror up to nature. And you're representing what you see in nature. But what you see in nature is not a copy or like a photograph of it. It is, you're trying to capture the essence of what you are describing. And you're painting a picture of it, more or less, in words. But you're trying to represent it or copy it. That's what you are doing. And the entire classical tradition is rooted in this. It's not just neoclassicism. It's the whole classical tradition believes that you're trying to capture in your words your object. So Wordsworth's enterprise here, pushing it away from words towards speech. Now, what's the difference between speech and words? One's oral and the other's written. That's basically what it is. And why would speech be preferable to writing? Is the question. And the basic explanation is, it falls in with the idea that when things are written down, they lose something of their inspired quality and become more civilized and more distant from the original intention of the author. And so they're the product of the loss of inspiration and the codification of everything. And there are many examples that are brought forth in the 18th century, but they get even stronger in the Romantic movement, that are leaning in the same direction, that regard the greatest minds as those who didn't write. Socrates being an example. Plato wrote, but Socrates didn't. Plato we acknowledge, but actually it's Socrates who is the inspiration for the whole thing. Likewise, Jesus. What books did Jesus write? Nobody. He didn't write any books, but he was the subject of others' writing. There are other examples of the belief that oral cultures are superior in their expression, their expressiveness, than our artificial cultures that come later. So the oral cultures come first, and they are the most poetic in their character. A strong belief in the poetic potency of oral cultures. And I think I already gave the example of Ossian. I mentioned Ossian, the alleged Celtic bard who ended up being an invention of James McPherson. You know, I've discovered these works by Ossian, and he writes them down, and there's a great rush of enthusiasm for the works of Ossian the bard. And what is so wonderful about him is that he is not following conventions. He's just following his natural spiritual leanings. So it privileges the spirit over the word. So there's a letter-spirit dichotomy here. And the idea that writing kills and loses the potency of the original inspiration. So a strong emphasis on spontaneity, and you'll hear this word spontaneity. It's here in Wordsworth. It will also play a prominent role in Kant's philosophy, Immanuel Kant. He'll talk about spontaneity. And the need to be natural as opposed to artificial. And I mentioned those, again, the privileging of natural over artificial being a product of this same sort of dichotomy. Speech as opposed to the written word. And a belief in a greater spirituality as a result. So it's seen as the word is against the spirit. Now, it's a strong dichotomy here. I think it's a totally false dichotomy, but it sets up a dichotomy which does not go away from the humanities. And it births, I'm getting a little bit away from this for a second, it births the Geisteswissenschaften in German, the spiritual sciences of Hegel. He writes a book called The Phenomenology of the Spirit, Phänomenologie des Geistes. It's a horrible book. Horrible word to say, even. But he presents West or learning in terms of a progressive. There's a thesis, there's an antithesis, and then there's a higher synthesis. But both of the thesis and the antithesis are just sort of placeholders, and they give way to progress as a result of that. And the aim there is to get to the spirit of the thing, and the Zeitgeist, word that we use in English, the spirit of the age. Germans love to compound words. Zeit, time, Geist, spirit. And those words, German words, often get copied into English because of the influence of this idea and their greater philosophical expression in German writing. Wordsworth is not the philosopher of his German contemporaries. That will give that honor to Coleridge. We'll talk more about Coleridge there when we come to Mr. Coleridge. But he is arguing that poetry is essentially speech. And I'll show you where that is in his preface here, and it surprises you when you first see it, and you think that can't be right, he doesn't mean that, but it's actually quite clear that he does mean that, which is a funny thing for a poet who writes poetry to write. And it has a result on the written word and a tendency to disparage the written word. Written words are words that you can pass on and read. And so it leads us, in a sense, away from past learning towards the future. So modern progressivism as an ideology is predicated on the idea that the word kills and the Spirit gives life. Not in the sense that Paul means it, but they will quote the Apostle Paul on this. So artifice is a form of a loss of inspiration. So the more natural the poetry is, the better. The more spontaneous it is, the better. The less Horace said you should edit over and over and over and hone and cut and edit and perfect your art, the writers of this period will emphasize how it just came to them in a dream and they wrote it down. Basically, unedited. Very much inspired by Milton's account of his writing of Paradise Lost, who says that the spirit dictated to him what he was going to write the next day, and he effectively wrote it down. He was divinely inspired. They see this as the poetic experience, Milton the great poet here. They will also see Shakespeare as another exemplar of the same process, because Shakespeare doesn't follow neoclassical poetics. He doesn't seem to follow the conventions that the modernist neoclassical scholars recommend. He seems to be his own, he dances to his own tune. He's a poet of nature. And yet he's greater than the ancients. So there's a quarrel between the ancients and the moderns. Again, I'll talk about that more in our lit theory class. We're not there yet. So Wordsworth has a different, he's opposed to it says even in the preface here, the little blurb written here at the beginning by Perkins, that he is opposing neoclassical poetics, but it's more radical than that. He is opposing poetics full stop. There is no precedent for Wordsworth's view of poetry. Not even in Longinus in his treatise on the sublime, which we'll read in next class. I mentioned already. We'll read that. Longinus is not talking about what Wordsworth and the Romantics will talk about when they're referring to the sublime. They mean something different. But anyway, the other aspect of this is the political aspect, which is that along with his attack on poetic tradition, he's also attacking the political authorities of his day, the establishment, conventions, and the establishment in general. And he was in favor of he elevated the rural life over the urban life significantly. So when Wordsworth says, I'm going to write about nature and about getting back to nature, he writes literally about being outside in the midst of a rural environment unsullied by human habitation, for which there is no correspondence in ancient writing. You can find poetry written like eclogues and idylls about rural and rustic life, and it's idealized, but it's not idealized for itself. It's idealized as a way of seeing things in an Edenic way, like the Garden of Eden type portrait. In Song of Songs, for instance, it's written probably of Solomon and his bride. It's even though the subjects as shepherds and shepherdesses, these are represented as figures that represent the king and his bride. And often in Hebrew, in the Hebrew mind, the shepherd is a figure for the king. He's often represented as a shepherd, even. And so there's something that is basic about the shepherd that also fits the king. Wordsworth doesn't talk about individuals, shepherds and shepherdesses, writing love poetry to each other. He talks about the poet and nature. There's no woman there. Nature is the woman. And the mind of the poet is the bridegroom. The mind of the poet and the natural world itself. So there's the shift. You move from human individuals in love in a rural environment to a human mind marrying the natural environment without a woman there. There's even though it's called Romanticism, there is no instances of what we would call romantic love in it. There are individuals. Wordsworth's poetry in the Lyrical Ballads is usually focused on individuals, and individuals in the presence of the natural world. And he ascribes supernatural significance to the natural world. So it's even though in some ways you can compare it to, bucolic poetry, ancient types of love poetry, in the setting, in the sense of setting, it seems similar. In other ways, it's totally different, because it's not meant to present to rural individuals as the ideals for the urban dwellers. It's an urban individual and the natural world as the lover. As I say, impossible to imagine in the ancient world. It's a significant shift. It moves away from the human interest of a man and a woman towards the mind and nature, a non-human object. This will become more clear when we actually look at the poetry. You'll see exactly how this transpires. But the individuals he portrays are often solitary, isolated individuals. And there's no sex. And there's no wooing, there's none of that. It's not just there's no sex, there's no even hint that there's what we would say is erotic. The erotic element of, like, say, Song of Songs or the pastoral poetry is just not there at all. So it's a sexless love, as you would expect if it's a mental a relationship, as it were. So the mind of the poet is uniting itself with the natural order. And so this is what gives rise to my charge that really what we have here is a sort of panentheism. There's a God in essence, in everything. It's in him, and it's also in the world around him. It's a highly abstract philosophical conception. And he thinks that the best poetry and the best object of poetry is in rural and rustic life. So I'm going to read some of this, and then I'll try and comment on it as a way of amplifying what I've just said already. As I said to you, although he wrote it on behalf of himself and Coleridge never was in agreement with what Wordsworth wrote and expressed dissatisfaction with it regularly. And eventually, he, 20 years on, wrote a response to it and destroyed Wordsworth, which is sort of amusing, but their friendship by this point, which was very close, was totally destroyed by that point. If it were not already, then the response certainly did that. And we can talk a little bit about this. But let me read a little bit. So the first volume of these poems has already been submitted. Let me see if I can. To general perusal. It was published as an experiment. This is also interesting. It was an experiment, which is a strange thing. This is scientific language. You don't do experiments in poetry. It's a thought experiment. Here, in this case, slightly different, but still, which I hope might be of some use to ascertain. And then what's the experiment trying to do? To ascertain how far, by fitting to metrical arrangement, a selection, now note the language here, of the real language of men in a state of vivid sensation. All of these terms that he uses will beg questions. What do you mean by the real language of men? Is, like, artificial language of the Neoclassical age is also the real language of men, because men wrote it, so it's the real language of men. But what do you mean by real? That's false, this is real. So Wordsworth tends to insinuate falsehood in a position that he doesn't clearly identify, and uses laudatory terms for his own project. So there's a disparaging going on here. It's the real language of man in a state of vivid sensation. That sort of pleasure and the quantity of pleasure may be imparted, which a poet may rationally endeavor to impart. I'll get back to this, the real language of man. I had formed no very inaccurate estimate of the probable effect of those poems. I flattered myself that they who should be pleased with them would read them with more than common pleasure. And on the other hand, I was well aware that by those who should dislike them, they would be read with more than common dislike. The result has differed from my expectation in this only, that a greater number have been pleased than I ventured to hope I should please. So he knew he would upset the establishment, but he didn't know that he would get the rapturous applause that he ended up getting. It was and later writers will talk about Wordsworth's poetry as a sort of a revitalization of Christianity against the sort of the scientific onslaught, the tendency of reductionist views of life, which they thought was killing off an apprehension of this being God's world and a spiritual reality in which we live. The scientific age was crushing that. Wordsworth brings back a sense of there being God's presence in and all around us. And so a sort of a spiritual awakening was taking place as a result of Wordsworth's poetry. Now, whether it's a Christian spiritual awakening is a different question, because not all spirits are the Holy Spirit. But that's how it was received. It was very warmly received. Several of my friends, he writes, are anxious for the success of these poems, from a belief that, if the views with which they were composed were indeed realized, a class of poetry would be produced and well adapted of interest to interest mankind permanently, and not unimportant in the quality and in the multiplicity of its moral relations. And on this account, they have advised me to prefix a systematic defense of the theory upon which the poems were written. Now, I can imagine Coleridge as being one of those. Give me a more of a philosophic defense here, which he's no good at, but that's what they want from him. Make it a bit more philosophical in its expression. Give us something to hold on to here. But I was unwilling to undertake that task. Why? Knowing that on this occasion the reader would look coldly upon my arguments, since I might be expected of having been principally influenced by the selfish and foolish hope of reasoning him into approbation of these particular poems. Why would they be struck cold? Because he would be appealing to their reason, and he doesn't want to appeal to their reason. He wants to appeal to their feelings. And so there's another dichotomy between reasoning and feeling. And his whole enterprise is moving away from the empirical, rational world of words and logic, and towards a sense or a feeling of connection, of unity. And I was still more unwilling to undertake the task, because adequately to display the opinions and fully to enforce the arguments would require a space wholly disproportionate to a preface. It would just take me too long. For to treat the subject with the clearness and coherence of which it is susceptible, it would be necessary to give a full account of the present state of the public taste in this country, and to determine how far this taste is healthy or depraved, which again could not be determined without pointing out in what manner language and the human mind act and react on each other. And without retracing the revolutions, not of literature alone, but likewise of society itself. So I'd have to undertake an even grander project. It wouldn't be only a discussion of poetry. It would have to be a discussion of social, moral development. And now I need to write a sociology treatise before sociology even exists. It would have to be a commentary on society and the development of morality and so forth. So he sees poetry, if you want to consider what I said this morning, I know not all of you were there, but that literature has two dimensions. It has a didactic dimension, it teaches, and it has a dimension of creating delight. And in order to show how it teaches, I would have to show where truth has erred in society. Truth has gone wrong. And that would be the effect of the literature. It's the literature that we have been reading has debased the public mindset, is Wordsworth's contention. His contemporaries have lost their religious sense of life. And he will attribute this to the whole poetic approach. I have therefore altogether declined to enter regularly upon this defense. Yet I am sensible that there would be something like impropriety in abruptly obtruding upon the public without a few words of introduction poems so materially different from those upon which general approbation is at present bestowed. So it is still the case that neoclassical poetics is the standard. It would be taught in schools as this is good poetry. And his poetry is very different from that. And so he needs to give some sort of introduction of what he's trying to do here, because he is the anti-establishment view. It's hard for us to see because Wordsworth's views are now the establishment, but not when he writes this. This is very much going against the grain. And why is that then? Why is that then? It is supposed that by the act of writing in verse, an author makes a formal engagement, that he will gratify certain known habits of association. I realize this sounds a little abstract, but that he not only thus apprises the reader that certain classes of ideas and expressions will be found in his book, but that others will be carefully excluded. This exponent or symbol held forth by metrical language must, in different eras of literature, have excited very different expectation. For example, in the ages of Catullus, Terence, and Lucretius, Roman poets. Note that Wordsworth has read Roman poetry in school. He went to grammar school, Hawkshead Grammar School. He had a classical education. He read Latin and Greek authors in the original. So he's acquainted with what he's reading about. This is not an unschooled man. The position that he's going to adopt will encourage other people to be unschooled. But he himself is not. Don't read those books. He never comes out so strongly to say don't read them, but the thrust of what he's saying is we don't need to hold on to what has been written in the past, the classics. He just happens to have read himself. And then in our own country, in the age of Shakespeare and Beaumont and Fletcher, and that of Donne and Cowley or Dryden or Pope, I will not take upon me to determine the exact import of the promise which, by the act of writing in verse, an author in the present day makes to his reader, but it will undoubtedly appear to many persons that I have not fulfilled the terms of an engagement thus voluntarily contracted. So I have to get into this. Blah, 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 blah. The principal object, then, I'll skip over the prefatory comments. The principal object, and this is where we get to the meat, proposed in these poems, was to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate or describe them throughout as far as was possible in a selection of language really used by men, and at the same time to throw over them a certain coloring of imagination whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual aspect. And further, and above all, to make these situations and incident situations interesting by tracing in them truly, though not ostentatiously, the primary laws of our nature. So, to clarify a bit, rather than using the subjects of neoclassical poetics, superior men, some sort of idealized human beings, his subjects are going to be common people. So if you want to see it in sociologically, rather than the aristocrats, the knights, the ladies, the kings, the queens, even their correspondences in shepherds and shepherdesses, I'd say, because it's still for kings and queens. He is going to literally write about shepherds and shepherdesses, commoners. And he's also going to write about children. And he's going to write about mad mothers. Mothers who've lost their children, they lost their minds. He's going to write about people who have been forced by dint of circumstances to be pushed into a life of crime. He's going to write about criminals. These are the common people. So if you want to remember the political aspect, if you want to think about this as the third estate, the commoners are represented by the third estate. You have and they're on the left of the king. There's the king, and then on the right of the king, you have the aristocrats and the clergy. But on the left, you have representatives of the common people, the third estate. Wordsworth is writing about those people. He's not writing about the clergy, he's not writing about the aristocrats, he's writing about the commoners. So it has that political aspect to it, but he's not explicitly politicizing it. It doesn't sound like here, but to his audience it would. It's clear where he's leaning. I'm right, these are the heroes. It's the common people that are the heroes of my poetry. And yet, what he's going to say is that in the common people, we're going to trace the primary laws of our nature, all of the people. It's not the commoners against the aristocrats, it's that the commoners better express something that they all share. We all share. It's an appeal to human nature. And before, there was a sense that the aristocrats were the image of God. This is the way the ancient world saw it in many ways. So in Genesis language, you have to understand when it says that Adam and Eve are made in the image of God, that is a circumlocution in the ancient world for saying that they are kings and queens. Because in the political language of that age, to be made in the image of God is to be a king. So this is a king. This is a god. Like the king is a god. You owe him your allegiance. In Babylonian creation myths, common people are presented as slaves, and the king is represented as the image of God. And so, of course, you can't question the political order. You are a different category of being altogether. Now, the Genesis account says that all of humanity is made in the image of God. It's a stark assertion of the nobility of every person. Wordsworth's poetics pushes his poetics in this direction by making the common man to have the dignity of kings. And he's effectively saying that there is a nobility and a grandeur to every person, every man, woman, and child. And this is great. I think this is wonderful stuff. And in many ways a very Christian take, and impossible to imagine without Christianity, actually. And so he will do this in order to trace the primary laws of our nature. Now, this is an inclusive, all of our human nature is shown in this. But it's going to be in the rustic setting or rural setting with the commoners being displayed here for themselves, not as some sort of ideal of the king, but who is the only one who bears the image of God, but as themselves. And why? Chiefly as far as regards the manner in which we associate ideas in a state of excitement. Humble and rustic life was generally chosen because in that condition, the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity, are under less restraint, and speak a plainer and more emphatic language. Because in that condition of life, our elementary feelings coexist in a state of greater simplicity, and consequently may be more accurately contemplated and more forcibly communicated, because the manners of rural life germinate from these elementary feelings and from the necessary character of rural occupations, are more easily comprehended and are more durable. And lastly, because in that condition the passions of men are incorporated within the beautiful and permanent forms of nature, capital N nature. That now he's saying a lot here. And it is, and I would say every point he makes is tendentious. It's as if it makes perfect sense, and it's could not be contested, but every assertion that he makes here is questionable. Do the essential passions of the heart find better soil in rural life? It's an assertion. What proof is there of this? It's pure assertion. They're under less restraint. Restraint from what? From society, from social conventions. They say what they feel. Again, it's a poetics of nature, nature being not debased by civilization. It's plainer and more emphatic, so it's more expressive, emotionally expressive. It's more simple, though. It's not confused by the noise of urban life. And the manners of rural life germinate from those elementary feelings. So basically, it is an elevation of the rural life to be the essence of civilization, and flip it on its head. Civilization is the debasement of rural life. So it's an attack on society. Wordsworth is a sociopath. Now, I don't mean this in a psychological, serial killer type thing. I mean it in more of its general sense, or its strict sense, that he thinks that society is the corruption of human nature. And isolation and solitude is the grounds for the perfection of human nature. He also presents nature as a good thing, unambiguously good. And what does he mean by nature? Now, if you want to read more about this, and I think you should consider it, C.S. Lewis, in his Studies in Words, looks at the word nature, spends 60 pages writing on the word nature and the history of the word nature from the classical world all the way up into Wordsworth, and says that the sense of nature that we have as an unfallen ideal state originates in the Romantics. It is not to be found before this. It's an ideal. And I said to you, in the first, in the introduction, that nature tends to have the connotations of good for us. It does not have those connotations in the ancient world. It's not even a word that's used in Scripture. They talked about creation. Creation and nature are not the same thing. Creation implies a creator. Nature sounds like it exists on its own. The Stoics refer to nature as having certain laws. But again, they're not theists, the Stoics. They're certainly moralists. So Wordsworth fits very much with the Stoical view of life, which I think is the easiest fit for the English people to this day, a sort of Stoicism. They admire Stoicism. There's certain political cultures that arise from national sensibilities, but the British like it when you don't complain, when you bear suffering with a stiff upper lip, when you do your duty and you don't expect to be acknowledged for it. Those are Stoic ideals, doing it for the common good and bearing up under suffering. It's also there in Virgil's Aeneid. It says Virgil is a Stoic. Many of the great Roman writers are Stoics. And so there's something to be said for Stoicism. However, it's not a Christian view, point of view, really. It's not that it's anti-Christian, it's more that it's sub-Christian. We can do better. Because Stoicism ultimately regards friendship as antithetical to human nature as well. Because your friend is somebody who can move your heart. The Stoic ideal is to be dispassionate, not moved by anything. As I say, it doesn't quite fit with Wordsworth because Wordsworth wants us to be moved by everything. So there's, as I say, an incongruity there. In fact, but he will say that the passions of men are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. Now, I don't even know what this means, but there's a sort of the green, the water, the air is imbued with feeling. There's a marriage between the mind and the universe, and he will explicitly speak in those terms in his poetry. We'll see this shortly. He has yet to give a definition here, by the way, but he's going to give this. And I'll see if I can find it here. Says there's a purpose to this, and it has a worthy purpose, but here's his first definition. All good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Every word in this is important. And each of the words that is used here will be taken apart by Coleridge. Coleridge is going to systematically take him apart for this assertion. We'll get to that in the Biographia. But he's making a very sweeping statement. He's writing against neoclassical poetics and saying, I'm not writing that sort, I'm writing this. And then he's going to assert that all good poetry is this. Well, that means that if what the 18th century wrote was not poetry. And since my argument is that nobody has ever had Wordsworth theory or articulated the way he does, that there never has been any good poetry before his. That will be the effect. I don't think he quite intends that, but that will be the end effect of it. And the reason why is because he associates good poetry with what? The spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Now, that might not strike you. It might think you, well, that's not a bad definition there. What is odd about this definition? Yes?
He's making the form of poetry identical with the feeling?
Correct. Correct. The feeling is the poetry. Spontaneously and powerfully overflowing, but it's not in words. This is why I said he's talking about the spirit, but it's not the verbal inscription. It's the feelings expressed. Take him at his words here. And you will find that his definition actually does articulate, it does express what he does in his poetry. He is wanting us to feel what he feels. He uses words to do that. And we'll look at the devices that he does to bring this about, and it's very artfully done, I have to say. Wordsworth is I'm going to sound like a critic of Wordsworth. I think Wordsworth is a brilliant poet. Very powerful. But his definition here can't hold. There might be some poetry that's like this. Coleridge will grant him that. It's certainly not true that all good poetry is this. And actually, when it comes down to it, nobody has ever agreed to this definition of poetry, and it's against the whole tradition of mimesis, which is the dominant form of poetic expression. If there are sub-movements in Western art, they are literally that, but they're minor. It's a minor key. Wordsworth is making a minor key into not just the major key. He's saying that this is and the other isn't poetry. That's the problem. He's the whole classes of poetry that don't fit Wordsworth's description, he's suggesting that's not poetry at all. It's overstating his case, at the very least. Now, why does he come to this? Sense of false modesty. There will be little in these volumes of what is usually called poetic diction. He's trying to avoid it. So the convention stylistic figures of poetic diction, he's trying to avoid it. And he's trying to make his language more like rural folk speak. Coleridge will observe, you'll never meet a farmer who speaks like Wordsworth's rustics speak. You'll never meet one. Nobody speaks like his rustics allegedly speak. It's true that it's not like the way it's in the 18th century, but it's still very artificial. But he does it allegedly to bring my language near to the language of men. Okay, but the language of men, are the other people not men? Yes, of course. But he means the common man. Further, because the pleasure which I propose is very different from that which is supposed by many persons to be the proper object of poetry. But why does he do this? At the present day, a sense of false modesty. Okay, so I must have skipped over it. Produce, different track, poetic diction. I wonder if it's in a different... I'll just read it from my text here on 425. Why does he do this? And why is it necessary for this poetic revolution to take place? He says on 425, right-hand column, a multitude of causes unknown to former times are now acting with a combined force to blunt the discriminating powers of the mind, and unfitting it for all voluntary exertion to reduce it to a state of almost savage torpor. Unknown in previous times. And what are these? The most effective of these causes are the great national events which are daily taking place, and the increasing accumulation of men in cities, where the uniformity of their occupations produces a craving for extraordinary incident, the news, which the rapid communication of intelligence hourly gratifies. This is intensified with social media and so forth. What's news? It's the 24-hour news cycle. It's always news. It's regularity. So he's talking about human life becoming more and more cookie-cutter mechanistic. More and more you have to fit in with a pattern of living and operating. The trains run on time, or allegedly run on time. Life, people have watches. We want you to show up on time. We want you to get up at time, eat the same things, do the same things. There's a uniformity about life. He thinks that this is crushing the human spirit in many ways. Accumulating people in cities is robbing something of our uniqueness. He talks about voluntary exertion. We can't actually will anything of our own. We just follow the crowd numbly. His criticism seems to me valid. Is his poetry an antidote to that? That's another question. But what he observes there, it seems like... And to this tendency of life and manners, the literature and theatrical exhibitions of the country have conformed themselves. The invaluable works of our elder writers, I had almost said the works of Shakespeare and Milton, are driven into neglect by frantic novels, sickly and stupid German tragedies, and deluges of idle and extravagant stories in verse. When I think upon this degrading thirst after outrageous stimulation, I am almost ashamed to have spoken of the feeble endeavor made in these volumes to counteract it. And reflecting upon the magnitude of the general evil, I should be oppressed with no dishonorable melancholy had I not a deep impression of certain inherent and indestructible qualities of the human mind, and likewise of certain powers in the great and permanent objects that act upon it, which are equally inherent and indestructible. And were there not added to this impression a belief that the time is approaching when the evil will be systematically opposed by men of greater powers and with far more distinguished success. Then he goes on to talk about the style. And to imitate, again, the real language of men, etc. Now he talks about the poet in here. And what is a poet? And all that. Now I'm wondering if okay, the poet is put in here. So let's talk about the character of the poet. However exalted a notion we would so this poetry will not depend on the poetry itself. It will depend more on the character of the poet. Because the object of study is not his words, but his mind. Not what he writes on the page, but the person behind it. It's an intense interest in psychology becomes the object of Romanticism. Where psychology is the modern discipline that we think it as, I mean, in Christian colleges, everyone takes psychology. They all want to be counselors. Like, what? Why does everyone want to be a counselor? Who's going to employ them? What's the counseling for? What do you think you're doing in the counseling? You're fixing their psyche. Why their psyche? Well, this is the essence of the person. Says who? Is this a full-orbed understanding of human nature? Now, be sure it's an aspect of it, but it's very ephemeral. It's very disembodied. It abstracts the psyche from the human body. It's a disembodied self. And Wordsworth will push us in this direction, and we will follow him in this direction, thinking that. And this is why I say we're all romantics. And in Christian circles, even doubly so, sadly, because our spiritual nature is thought to be captured by the discipline of psychology, which is a pseudoscience for the most part. Anyway, but what does he say? However exalted a notion we would wish to cherish of the character of a poet, it is obvious that while he describes and imitates passions, note here's the mimesis, he imitates passions. There's the mimesis. His employment is in some degree mechanical compared with the freedom and power of real and substantial action and suffering. So the real reality is genuine suffering and genuine passion. And the poet only imitates that. So how do we get to the real thing? It's, again, the Platonic critique. It's just a shadow. The imitation of suffering isn't real sufferings. So how do we get closer? So that it will be standing between the poet and the image of things. Between this and the biographer and historian, there are 1,000. How do we get this then? So that it will be the wish to bring his feelings nearer to those of the persons whose feelings he describes, nay, for short spaces of time, perhaps to let himself slip into an entire delusion, and even confound and identify his own feelings with theirs, modifying only the language which is thus suggested to him by a consideration that he describes for a particular purpose, that of giving pleasure, to teach and delight. He's going to give pleasure. But how is this mimesis going to take place? It's through method acting. I'm going to act like I'm going to be this person. You know the theories in acting. I don't know if you've been involved in acting, but one is to actually imagine that you are the person and to live your entire life as if you're that person. Some people do it. Daniel Day-Lewis is famous for this. Heath Ledger was famous for this. He imagined that he was the character he was presenting all the time. It was not switch on and now I'm the character. It's I'm this character all the time. And the response of Sir Laurence Olivier to this method acting is, well, you know, I act. I'm acting. I put on a role. I'm not that person. I'm not identifying with that person, except insofar as I'm acting like that person, but I am not that person. But in Romanticism, they are casting their psyche into that person. It's a spiritual act. Modern forms of psychology often replicate this idea of becoming that person. You have to share, you don't know what it's like to be me. To which I respond, of course I don't, because I'm not you. But what's your point? And the person that says that believes that their uniqueness bars you from understanding who they are because there's no common humanity. The uniqueness is a barrier to common understanding. And so the only, which is a false view, of course, but the only resolution to this problem is for me to worship their self-identification. I can't understand what it's like to be them, but I guess I can, applaud you for being who you are. Okay, great. Let me celebrate that. But there's no actual movement towards common understanding because, again, the commonality of human nature has been destroyed by the strong claim of radical identity. Again, these are debased views of human nature. Wordsworth presents them as a democratic movement, but I think they are deeply problematic in part because they're disembodied. But anyway, that was a very poor introduction to the subject because it's a little bit deeper than that. But the general thrust of it, I think, I've already got there. And the main thrust is that he talks about the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. That is what all good poetry is. It is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So that feeling of sympathy for people is now poetry. Very odd. Extraordinary. But it is the spirit of the literature that comes after it. It becomes more and more and more dominant over time. It will affect education theory. It will affect religion. It will affect hymnody. We'll get into singing individualistic choruses rather than hymns, or let alone the Psalms, singing the Psalms. We'll sing, it will be individualistic. Me and God, me and everything else. And it'll be expressing myself. It's very romantic. So one way that a writer that I put on the syllabus, M.H. Abrams, dichotomizes this neoclassical versus romantic, he calls it the mirror and the lamp. It's pretty good. So the old poetics is the mirror, and the new poetics is the lamp, the light from within that expresses itself outwardly. I mean, it's useful just as a way of holding on to a basic difference, and I think it's more or less correct. Anyway, I'll leave it off for that for now.